Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's educational webinar hosted by International Trade Council. My name is Ron Alaska, and I'm delighted to be your moderator for today's session. So, before we start our discussion, let's take care of some quick housekeeping matters. Firstly, can everyone hear me clearly? If you can hear me, please type in yes in the chat box. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you for confirming. Now let's ensure that everyone can see the PowerPoint presentation slides. If you're experiencing any issues with the audio or visual, please let me know in the chat box and I will assist you promptly. So it seems that everything is running smoothly. Just a quick reminder to our attendees, if you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type in the Q&A box located in your webinar interface. We'll address as many questions as possible during the Q&A session following the presentation. So without any further ado, let's get started for today's educational webinar. So for our topic for today is export diversion risk and worldwide US government enforcement. We're excited to have you with us explore the important topic of US export controls. Throughout today's session, we will be covering several critical areas, including the nature and scope of US export control jurisdiction, the types of items that are subject to these controls, and key risk points related to the diversion of export controlled items to restricted destination and parties. We'll also look at US government export enforcement priorities and trends, and we'll wrap up by discussing best practices for ensuring compliance. Please join me in welcoming our speaker, Anthony Rapa, partner and co-chair, International Trade Group, Black Rome LLP. Go ahead, Anthony.
Great. Thank you, Ron. And thank you to the International Trade Council, and thanks to everyone in the audience for joining. So specifically, what we wanted to do here was to deliver this content to an overseas audience live. So I am in the Washington, D.C. area, specifically in Virginia in the U.S. It's 1 a.m. where I am, but afternoon for our guests. So definitely happy to be speaking here. So just a very brief introduction. Anthony Rappa, as Ron said, I'm the co-chair of the International Trade Practice at Blank Rome, which is a full-service law firm in the United States. My practice focuses on export control, which is what we'll focus on here specifically. In addition to that, my practice includes sanctions, which is related to this subject, and also review of foreign investment in the United States. So today we're going to be covering export diversion risks, which in the world of international trade and national security and geopolitical risk has really emerged as an important subject and a major focus of U.S. government enforcement, both civil and criminal enforcement, as we've seen. And this subject concerns the diversion of sensitive or controlled items, such as equipment, to restricted destinations, such as Russia, which right now is probably the number one issue in this area. So let's get into these specifics. So today's session is going to, for the most part, we are going to focus on export controls. Now, many of you may already be familiar with this subject. Many of you may be familiar with the subject of sanctions. The two subjects are related, but they're different. Sanctions has become very well known as a subject within the area of international trade, particularly with the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine over 2 years ago. Sanctions has become very much a dominant topic of conversation. However, mostly what we're going to focus on here is export control, which has to do with the movement of sensitive goods, software, and technology. Again, these are related subjects. We're going to explore some of the differences between sanctions and export control. this is mostly focused on export control, which, in my view, as time goes on, export control is going to be the dominant regulatory regime that the United States is going to use for geopolitical issues around the world, because these are trade laws that the United States can use very much in an extraterritorial way. Um, so, because of the way that these laws can be used extraterritorially, they are very much strategically significant for the United States. And the United States has used these kinds of export control laws, particularly when it comes to Russia, which we're definitely going to talk about here. These laws have been very significant regarding the United States' relationship with China and some of the challenges as between the United States and China. And within this area of export control, the subject of diversion is very important. And that is, in the United States, has really become a key word. And the reason why I wanted specifically to deliver this presentation to this audience is because the United States government's focus on this question of diversion is on countries outside the United States, but also countries that are maybe not very closely aligned with the United States. So, right now, the US, the EU, the UK, Japan, um, Australia are very much, Canada are very connected in handling these kinds of export control issues together. And for countries that are outside of that group, there are real challenges regarding how to comply with the export control and how to avoid the diversion of sensitive goods to places like Russia or, in some cases, China, as we'll talk about. Um, so, very much, particularly Asia, particularly the Middle East, very real compliance challenges in connection with this subject. So, um, during this session, I will provide an overview of export control. I want to be careful for that not to dominate the topic because we are here to talk about diversion. But in order to get to the subject of diversion, we need to first establish what are the U.S. export controls. Why do we care about diversion? So to get there, mainly we are focused today on the Export Administration Regulations. We call that the EAR. In Washington, D.C., we love abbreviations for everything. So EAR is one of them. And the EAR regulate, as I said, the movement of goods, software, and technical information. Um, we're going to get into just how extensive that is, and especially how that can be very extraterritorial under the U.S. rules. But for our purposes here in the beginning, these are the rules that control the movement of dual use goods. So, dual use meaning that these are the kinds of goods that are suitable for both a commercial and for military use. So, these export controls control the movement, as I said, of goods, software, and technology. When you combine all of those terms together, we use the word item to encompass really all of those subjects. So an item includes physical items, physical commodities, as they call it, physical equipment, hardware, components, um, material. That there's a physical element to this, but then there are intangible elements too. So the export controls cover software, and that includes both object code and source code, and technology. And when we use the word technology, we mean technical information. So, information that is needed for the development, production, or use of an item. So now we get to, in this slide, is a really, really important concept. One of the real highlights of this session today, which is what items are subject to the US EAR. This is the reason why we're here, is because it's not only when you export something out of the United States that we need to be concerned with these laws. It's a lot broader than that. So, as a starting point, it is what I just said. Number one, anything that's located in the United States that is an item is subject to the US EAR. But then moving beyond that, um, anything that is produced in the United States, wherever it is located in the world, wherever it travels, if something is US origin, it is subject to the US EAR forever until it is consumed or destroyed, or if it is transformed into a different item. But if it, um, this pen, if this pen were made in America, I don't know if it is, but this pen, if it were made in America, wherever you would find it in the world, the U.S. Department of Commerce has jurisdiction over the movement of that item. The next category is items that are produced outside the United States that incorporate more than a de minimis level of controlled U.S. content. So, in other words, again, let's think of a physical piece of equipment. A physical piece of equipment that is incorporating maybe more than 25% US content, which for the most part, that is the threshold. Sometimes it's 10, depending on the rule. But if it incorporates more than 25% US content, then possibly that piece of non-US equipment, let's say again, it's made in China, and it has more than 25%, it's got 40% US content inside. It's possible that that Chinese item is actually subject to US export control. And then finally, and this is a really significant expansion of the rules, is non US items that are based on or that are directly derived from US technology or US software. So, in other words, you might have the design information coming from the United States, or you might be using US design software to generate to produce something outside the United States. And in some cases, um, many cases now today, the non-US item is going to be subject to the US EAR in that event, even without any US content. So these are very, very broad concepts. And just so everyone knows, because this is really the dominant thing in geopolitics today, this is what the United States is using when it comes to regulating chips, especially AI chips. It's this set of laws and it's these concepts, particularly that last concept about something being the direct product of US technology. So, this is all very important for us to know, not only for today, not only for diversion, but generally speaking, this subject matter has become very important for industry around the world. So what do the EAR regulate and why do we care about how does that connect with diversion? So the EAR apply to exports, meaning shipments that are out of the United States, but also re-exports. So shipments be from one third country to another country. Um, and then finally transfers in country of an item. So, in other words, if an item changes hands from one person to another, one end user to another inside the same country, that is also an event that is covered by the EAR. Now, here I think is a good point to make the comparison with sanctions, because again, sanctions is probably much better known today. And again, as I said, that is because of the entire impact of the war in Ukraine, and sanctions is a term that's used all of the time. Sanctions, for the most part, are concerned with the actions of people and the actions of companies based on mainly based upon their nationality. So, no, so what I mean by that is because I'm a U.S. person, wherever I go in the world, I need to follow U.S. sanctions, or a U.S. company needs to follow U.S. sanctions. A European company has to follow European sanctions. A Singaporean person has to follow what the monetary authority in Singapore says regarding sanctions. Export control is different, especially U.S. export control. So, U.S. export control applies to the item, not only based on the nationality. There's just a little bit in the rules concerns with nationality, just a little. Otherwise, we look at the item. And if the item is made in the US, if it has more than de minimis US content, if it's based on US technology or software, then the US export controls attach to that item and it follows it everywhere around the world. It's a very unique concept as compared to what most other countries do. And that is really what forms the basis for this whole diversion theme, which is the idea that the United States will retain jurisdiction over these kinds of items for extended periods of time. So, this is a subject I don't like to mention, but in a presentation like this, we do need to mention it, which is that another reason why we're here now. Why are we talking about diversion? Why would anyone care? Um, the penalties are very severe. Potentially, they're very severe for this under these rules. Um, Similar to sanctions, where the penalties are the same as they are under sanctions, and the reason for that is these rules are connected with national security, which is taken very seriously in the United States as it is in many other places. Um, and you can see the numbers on the screen. These are maximums. So this, you should be aware that, practically speaking, the penalty can end up looking a lot different from this. Um, but again, maximums, civil penalties of up to about 365, $370,000 US per violation, or twice the value of the transaction, whichever is greater, and criminal penalties of up to $1 million per violation and up to 20 years in prison. Now, the other important aspect of these rules, regarding penalties, is that these regulations operate on a strict liability basis. So, what does that mean? Strict liability means that you can be held liable, you can be penalized under the rules just for an honest mistake. Uh, it doesn't matter if you if you acted negligently or not. There does not need to be a showing of intentional misconduct or recklessness. Um, Regardless of your state of mind, if you export something subject to the EAR to a destination where it does not belong, or with to send it to a person that is not authorized to receive it, even if you had the best of intentions, you can sustain civil penalties as a result of that. Now, not criminal, Criminal penalties require a very high showing, which is called willfulness, which means intentional misconduct. That is very serious. But for everything else, for all of the civil penalties, we only need a showing of strict liability. And I should mention, because I don't know if I've covered it yet until now, but for civil violations, the EAR are administered by the U.S. Department of Commerce. That's the agency, it's the department within the U.S. government that administers the rules and enforces the civil penalties. And finally, on the subject of penalties, um, for these laws, there's a 5-year statute of limitations, um, meaning that the government, for 5 years after the event takes place, could charge someone with a violation of the rules. Everyone should note that when it comes to sanctions, which are administered by the U.S. Department of the Treasury, sanctions are now subject to a 10-year statute of limitations. So um, they are phasing that in now. It's not quite fully in effect, but as time goes on, companies can be held accountable for actions now going back 10 years for sanctions violations. So we're going to go through some of these points a little bit quickly because I do not want this to turn entirely into an export control seminar, although I definitely welcome the opportunity to talk about that some other time. But just so that everybody knows, because this helps us to get to the subject of diversion, understanding all of this stuff, because we've been talking about what are export controls, what does it mean for an item to be subject to the EAR, what is an item, what is an export, but the question of diversion focuses on when you are providing an item to a place or to a person that is not authorized to receive it. So, what does it mean to be authorized? When do you need something to be authorized? In the world of the EAR, in the world of U.S. export control, a possible restriction or a possible export licensing requirement exists on the basis of the destination. So, where is the item going? Secondly, there could be a requirement based on the end use. So, how is it being used? Or there could be a requirement based on the end user. So, who is the person or who is the company that's using the item at the end? Um, and for all of these things, the overarching question is what is the export classification that applies to the item? And by classification, I mean that within the regulations, there's a long list of controlled items, um, which the Commerce Department expects us to review and to be able to compare the classification codes that are on that list and then the product descriptions to compare those against the item that we want to export. So those are all of the things that go into determining whether you need a license or not. And that's going to determine your risk of diversion, really. Um, and we'll get into some of the specifics in the next few slides. And the other thing to keep in mind is that even when you might technically be subject to a licensing requirement, there are exceptions in the rule, as there is with everything else that we do in this area. There are license exceptions in some cases that do exist under the regulations. So we'll cover this quickly, but as I said, export classification, that is really the starting point to comply with export controls, and it's the starting point to be on guard against diversion risk. So, what that means is knowing what your item is and being aware of the level of sensitivity that applies to that item. And the way to evaluate that is to look at the U.S. Commerce Control List, the CCL, another abbreviation. The CCL is a list of various controlled items. It's divided into 10 categories, 0 through 9. So 10 categories um, according to the type of product that it is. So there's a category for electronics, another for computers, sensors and lasers, aviation, aerospace, marine, so forth. It's divided that way. And then within each category is a list of descriptions, technical descriptions um, for controlled items. And once we know that information, that helps us to identify, do you need a license to send something somewhere, an export license from the Commerce Department? And it also helps us to understand what is the level of diversion risk. So, do we have an item that is controlled for a place like Russia, or it's controlled for China or another place, to the point where we're concerned that someone is trying to obtain this item maybe without permission, or there's um, a compliance burden associated with it. We need to know that. That's all downstream of understanding what is the classification. So then the destination restrictions. Remember I said there are three aspects to whether you need a license. Where is the item going? How is it being used? Who's using it? So for the destination restrictions, we need to know the classification. And every part of the classification number is going to provide some information that we call the reason for control, which is a specific term, reason for control. Um, Once you know the reason for control, there's a chart in the regulations that on one axis has the reasons for control across the top, and on the other axis has every country in the world. And you just compare the axes to see if you have a licensing requirement or not for destination reasons. There are also end use and end user controls. So those are the second and third ways you can have an export control, um, or rather an export licensing requirement. So, and number one, as I said, end use controls, meaning how is the item being used? There could be restrictions on things like using an item for weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons, development of rockets and missiles. Um, there could be certain kinds of restrictions in connection with the military end use. Also, we don't have it on here, but there are also now end use restrictions related to semiconductor exports. So if items are going to be used for supercomputers, if they're going to be used in support of advanced node semiconductor production, particularly in China, but other places too. Those are end use controls. Additionally, we have controls in connection with the end user. So mainly, what that means is that if there's a end user that is on a restricted list, for example, the entity list as published by the Commerce Department, and there are others. There's the denied persons list, other restricted lists. If the end user is a restricted party, then you need an export license to send the item to that person. So probably today, the most famous example in the world of that is Huawei. So even to send, again, we look back to the pen, even to send this pen to Huawei, If I'm sending it from the US or if it's made in America, that requires a Commerce Department license because of the end user restriction. It's a good example. This pen is not under any export control for China as a country, but because the end user, in this case, hypothetically, Huawei, is restricted, I need an export license to send them my pen. So now we'll start to get into just a couple of particular areas of focus that really connect with the subject of diversion. So, number one, Russia. Um, so, Russia, as everybody knows, is subject to extensive US sanctions, extensive US export control. The same thing goes for various other countries. As of right now, for Russia, there are very expansive export controls that are in place. So the export controls will first of all apply to anything that is on the Commerce Control List, the CCL. Also, there has been an expansion of the direct product rule for exports to Russia, meaning there are a lot of non US items that are made with US technology that because of that use of the US technology, they are prohibited to be exported to Russia. So that's another thing. And another aspect of these kinds of export controls is that not only does it cover items that are on the control list when it comes to Russia, it covers a lot of other things that are not on that list that are really just kind of industrial items that would ordinarily not be controlled to go anywhere. But industrial items, industrial equipment, electronic components, low level semiconductor, legacy chips, very basic, again, like I said, electronics, power supplies, all of that and a lot more is subject to export control for Russia. So the other major country that is under this kind of restriction is China. Not to the same extent as Russia. It's actually a lot different. But for China, I think, as everybody knows, um, the U.S. and China continue to have a complex relationship when it comes to trade, and that includes the United States making use of export control to restrict the flow of technologies, especially advanced and emerging technologies, to China. Um, there are some notable examples of this, like my Huawei example, and there are other companies on the entity list, like DJI, the drone manufacturer, semiconductor manufacturing international corporation, SMIC. Um, and then, in addition to that, again, perhaps as a lot of people know, over the last 2 years, the Commerce Department has put in place very expansive and very complex export controls in connection with AI chips and in connection with semiconductor manufacturing equipment for China. So those kinds of items present very significant diversion risk because of how in demand, excuse me, in demand they are right now. So now we get into the actual subject matter. Why are you here? Um, so we've spent all that time building up this subject of export control um, to get to the actual topic, which is the question of diversion. Um, so as we have developed in the first part of this discussion, um, export controls, the U.S. export controls are complex. They are far reaching. They're extraterritorial. Um, they apply to a lot of different kinds of hardware items and software and technical data. if it has some kind of a connection with the United States. And where we have landed as a result of that is that in the last 2 years, the US government, but also the US partners, have been very focused on this problem of diversion. So, diversion, when I use that term, I mean taking a controlled item or taking a sensitive item. Controlled is another way for saying you need a license to move it, or it's another way of saying it's sensitive. Taking a sensitive item um, that is permissible to be where it currently is, um, but then taking that and sending it to a destination where it should not be, or sending it to a person who should not receive it. So let's say the United States exports um, power supplies to Thailand, and a company in Thailand takes that. Let's say it's a distributor in Thailand that covers the regional market in Asia. Um, if that distributor exports that power supply item to Russia, um, that's a violation of the U.S. export control rules, and that Thai company could be penalized for that because it originated in the U.S. and then they diverted it to Russia. So this is really a very significant issue. Um, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, very significant for companies in Asia and in the Middle East, which are not mostly are not really taking any sides in the geopolitical argument, but they're getting drawn into it anyway because of the way these diversion rules apply. Um, so it's not only the United States, it's also the G7. You see the flags of the G7 nations here on this slide. The G7 is very focused on the risk of diversion. Um, a couple of countries maybe think about that regarding China. All of them think about that subject in connection with Russia. Um, and it's so important that I put the word very in bold on this slide. It is a very important subject for the governments in the G7 countries. Um, within the United States, the U.S. government has formed a task force. And what I mean by task force is there is a group of government agencies and government authorities that specifically look at diversion happening around the world and look at technology exports that are occurring. And they focus on potential violations of the USEAR in relation to that. So that is the Disruptive Technology Strike Force. It's a combination of effort between the Commerce Department and the Department of Justice. And what we understand in DC is that this strike force is conducting many investigations right now, and they're very active in investigating and even prosecuting. So, again, what are they looking for? They're looking for um, a controlled item that they know or they have strong reason to believe is ending up in a place like Russia. Or the most common example of this, because it comes up in the news all the time, is a drone could be shot down on the battlefield in Ukraine, and then the Ukrainian military captures the drone and opens it up, and they find American parts inside the drone. Um, that's what diversion is, and that's why the authorities are so focused on it, which is especially the use of U.S. items and other things subject to the EAR to support Russia's military efforts. Um, to some other extent, that same kind of concern also exists when it comes to sensitive exports to China. So within the all of this, the entire realm of export control and the entire realm of diversion, um, when it comes to exports to Russia in particular, um, there are a set of rules, or rather, there are certain kinds of items that are known as common high priority list items, CHPL. Um, why does it have this name? Well, number one, it's common in the sense that the US and the EU and some other partners came together to identify together the kinds of items they do not want to go to Russia. Um, and it's high priority list because these are the kinds of specific items that these governmental authorities and governments do not want to go to Russia. So on that basis, um, you can see here on the screen what some of those are. If you're active in an industry that is buying or selling or dealing in, transacting in these kinds of items, integrated circuits, electronics, electronic test equipment, um, certain kinds of mechanical components, machine tools, um, that type of stuff is now considered to be high priority because these are the kinds of items that are very suitable for military use, including by Russia. And for that reason, we're seeing a lot of regulation now in connection with these CHPL items. So in Europe, um, Europe is specifically, they're about to specifically require companies to conduct a risk assessment if they're exporting a CHPL item, a risk assessment to make sure that it's not going to be re-exported to Russia after they sell it. Um, and in the U.S. now, and we'll turn to this very shortly, um, the U.S. is putting in place special almost requirements if you have a CHPL item, so that they're strongly encouraging you to conduct uh, very deep screening on your counterparty to make sure they're not restricted. They're not going to send your item to Russia. Um, so it's a very this common high priority list is a very active area. And again, if you're in one of these industries or involved in one, definitely take a look at the list. So diversion on paper, diversion, I think we can all kind of say, we don't support diversion. We don't want to do this stuff. We understand the risk. We get that. Um, Practically speaking, what are some of the common challenges when it comes to diversion? Um, and really, the biggest challenge here is that there are a lot of countries in the world that have not decided to put in place any kind of sanction or export control. These are countries that just favor open trade. They favor good relationships with everybody. Um, and countries and the companies in those kinds of countries. And again, I'm focusing in my experience. That's a lot of countries in Asia, countries in the Middle East. Um, Companies that are in those countries may not feel as if they have even remotely any type of U.S. legal obligation that has to do with their operations. Um, and very often that's a mistake. Um, so again, the issue is a company that's in a country where they're not going to support U.S. sanctions, they're not going to support U.S. export control, they don't want to get involved. Um, but the rules still apply in that country, and that's a very big risk. Um, Additionally, what are some common challenges? Another common and significant challenge is these common high priority items lists, these common high priority list items going to Russia. So, again, electronics, power supplies, um, test equipment for electronics, um, certain kinds of machine tools, mechanical components. That really is heavily that has attracted very heavy scrutiny now because this stuff keeps turning up in Russia, keeps turning up in battle in Ukraine. Um, so that's a common challenge. Another has to do with exporting advanced, as I said, advanced AI chips to China, um, where these chips are very in demand right now, obviously. And the US export control laws can prohibit some of that from going to China. And again, that's an area where you can find a diversion risk for that reason. So, very hungry appetite in China for this kind of equipment, this kind of technology, but there's a legal restriction. And somewhere between the two, you might have parties that are helping to divert the controlled items. Um, and then, finally, the very common challenge is bad actors that are coming into transactions with the intention of themselves diverting something to Russia or to another um, restricted country or to a restricted party. So one term for this is straw buyers. So they're purely buying your product on behalf of someone else that they're keeping a secret, and it could be someone in Russia. Um, and also the use of shell companies has become a real problem for, including for the U.S. government. So creating or using um, companies, newly formed companies that are not bona fide, to basically trick companies into selling to them, and then these shell companies really exist to serve the interests of a Russian company or to serve the interest of diverting items into Russia. So there are some guidance documents that people should be aware of, and we'll focus really just on one of them, but we're going to mention a couple of other ones. This guidance came out only a few months ago over the summer. An entire um, published document coming from the Commerce Department on the question of diversion. And what this guidance reminded everybody is that number one, the Commerce Department might send you certain kinds of communications um, advising you that you're dealing with a company that they say is involved in diversion of products, particularly to Russia. And they have different letters, different mechanisms and vehicles whereby they can send that to you. And also, this guidance tells you how you're expected to respond when you get something like that. Um, Now, there's one other interesting aspect of this guidance, which sets it apart from everything else on the page, is that the guidance also says that when you export um, a common high priority list item, that they strongly encourage you to screen the counterparty using the screening tool that is put out by the Trade Integrity Project, which is a nonprofit. I believe it's a nonprofit that maintains some kind of a screening service. And that's a service that supposedly identifies um, whether a counterparty has engaged in exports to Russia. Now, we don't know where the Trade Integrity Project gets their information. It's that part's not revealed, but there are a lot of different services that have emerged in connection with the possible function to identify diversion risk companies. We'll hear a little bit more about that towards the end of this presentation. So there are a couple of other noteworthy guidance notes that have come out over the last 18 months. Both of these that are described here are called tri-seal notes. So tri-seal, meaning that there are three different government agencies involved in publishing this information. So the U.S. Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Commerce, the U.S. Department of Treasury have joined together to put out these bulletins regarding the risk of diversion and how to counteract that risk. So there was, one that came out in March of 2023, another that came out a year later, and these are things that are worth reading, they are quite informative regarding how these government departments are going about combating diversion and investigating cases involving it. So, what are the consequences of diversion? So, we talked about the penalties before. We know the dollar amounts. But there are other consequences besides these severe civil and criminal penalties that could exist. Beyond the penalties, a company that engages in diversion could be designated on a sanctions list or could be designated on a restricted export list. And if those kinds of things happen, then that company could be subject to an asset freeze. It could be cut off from the US market. It could be cut off from US suppliers, or it can lose access to the U.S. financial system. In particular, financial institutions can lose access to U.S. correspondent accounts if they are found to be supporting diversion. So this is really important, especially for an audience that's outside the United States, because sometimes the U.S. authorities can find a way to penalize a company outside the U.S., but when they cannot, this other stuff is at their disposal. Even without a monetary penalty, they could cut them off from all U.S. business, which might even be worse than a penalty. So there are really kind of extensive powers that the agencies have to inflict consequences for supporting diversion. So, what are some of the tips to manage this? Now we've spent so much time talking about the risk, but what are some of the tips to actually manage this kind of diversion risk? So, number one, first and foremost, most important thing is to have a international trade export control sanctions compliance program. Um, Particularly if you have those high priority list items, but even if you don't, if you have any connection with US goods, US technology, US content, US persons, US dollars, it really makes sense to have a compliance program. And this can include, first of all, a policy. It could also include a procedure regarding how the company is going to conduct screening of counterparties. screening to detect whether these counterparties are on a sanctions list or an export list. Um, there might be other kind of screening that's appropriate, which we'll hear a little bit more about later on. Also, the Trade Integrity Project. Um, Also, consider using in your contracts um, terms and conditions regarding export compliance, because that could be, in some cases, that could be a good way to manage what your customer is doing down the chain, where you're not going to be involved, but you can still manage what did they do with the item that you're selling them. Um, Finally, in this regard, um, be aware, as I've mentioned before, but continue to keep it in your mind. Be aware of the extraterritorial reach of the U.S. EAR. I think that is the biggest mental barrier to get through, which is that everyone assumes, not everyone, but many people assume outside the United States, you're outside the U.S., you're making things outside the U.S., you don't have any reason to worry about the U.S. But these rules can be extraterritorial if you have these kinds of connections through the United States, like content or design technology. Um, so finally, a very important aspect of combating diversion and compliance with export laws is identifying red flags. And in this case, these red flags have come directly from the Commerce Department, so they really are worth looking at in their entirety. If you're engaged in international trade, which you're sitting in on an International Trade Council webinar, so you probably are. Um, Being aware of these red flags is very important. So think about things like um, they might have an address. They're sharing an address with a restricted party that's on the list. Um, the buyer is a purchasing agent that isn't gonna. They don't want to tell you who the end user is. Um, the product purchase seems a little bit weird for the company's line of business, so they provide the example of a bakery that's buying sophisticated computers. Um, the company seems, this is a very important one. This happens a lot. The company seems to be newly formed. It has no background. Um, is it a bona fide company or not? Um, that's a red flag. Um, the customer is willing to pay cash for something very expensive is another red flag. And just to complete the thought, and really move towards the end of our presentation, when it comes to red flags, um, there are some others to keep in mind, such the customer could be looking for, um, you know, they're not interested in any product support from you. Um, they're asking you to use a weird or strange shipping route, um, a circuitous or indirect shipping route that doesn't make sense. Um, the buyer doesn't provide you documents that you ask them for. They don't want to tell you how the product is being used. They react strangely to your questions. Um, Something weird like they could list a freight forwarding company as the final destination or the final end user. Um, those are the kinds of things that, in the world of export compliance and in the world of diversion, um, are very important red flags and important to keep in mind, because, again, if you have these controlled items subject to the EAR, particularly if you have these high priority list items, then this really is an area of significant focus. So, to move towards the conclusion, um, thank you for your time on this subject. Um, just so that everyone knows, Blank Rome, we put out a monthly international trade report. We welcome you to follow that. It provides a lot of this content, which is hopefully helpful to you. Um, and to wrap up, first of all, I'm happy to answer any questions in case any pop might come through in the chat. Also, there's a product to monitor and to help map trade and to help manage trade compliance. A lot of these products are coming out. One of them is a new product called Atom FTD. And Ron is going to tell you about that product. But thank you, everyone, for your time. Feel free to reach out to me directly if you'd like, or put in questions here during the time we have left. I'll turn it back to Ron.
All right, thank you for that, for sharing their valuable insights today about the topic. Before we proceed, I would like to ask if there are some questions. Please feel free to type in your questions in the Q&A tab. And I'd like to take a moment to highlight Adam FTD, a powerful platform developed by ICTTM and ITC. If you're interested in streamlining your trade compliance processes and gaining deeper market intelligence, Adam FTD offers an incredible suite of tools to help your business stay ahead in the ever-changing global trade landscape. So for more information about it or to get started, feel free to reach out to us and we're happy to connect you with the right resources. So before we proceed with the questions, just want to announce that this webinar is recorded. So if you would like to replay, just go to our International Trade Council YouTube channel, and everyone will receive a certificate of participation for attending this webinar. And if anyone in the group is not yet a member of International Trade Council, please feel free to approach me and we can offer you pre-membership. So we can extend for a few minutes for the question because I'm seeing questions here. First one is, how are we going? Oh, just the PPT. Anthony, can we share the PowerPoint presentation?
Yeah, Ron, but as long as that's okay with your, your policy with the
Yeah,
Trade Council, yeah, but
sure.
we should do that. Yes.
Okay, sure. So yeah, we can definitely just send me an email and we can share a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. Any more questions? Please feel free to type in here in the Q&A box. And I'm just seeing here feedback that the presentation is very informative. So thank you. All right. I don't see any questions here right now. I think everything has been covered and well explained. So before we conclude the webinar, I would like to ask Anthony on his final or parting words to the audience.
Yes. So, final parting words. Number one, really thank you again to the council, and thank you for everyone in the audience for joining. Um, we live in a time of where the world of trade is changing, and where the geopolitics are changing, and we find more trade barriers. And probably this is a trend. Hopefully, things can stay manageable and trade flows are very good. But this is a trend in terms of more barriers around trade. And I do encourage, I'm sure everyone already is doing this, but the US election is going to play a very important part in this as well, regarding how these laws are going to unfold. So we're watching that obviously very closely in the US, but it's worth also taking that into account in your business planning, because the US election will have an impact on these subjects, certainly. So it's a world of trade barriers, but also they could be managed through, mainly and most importantly, through a good, solid compliance program that mitigates your risks. Um, that is really the most important thing. Ron, I see that
Yes,
looks like another
there's
question
one
may have
question
come
here.
in.
Yeah, we can
Yep.
address the question. When the product shipped DPL before on the list, the can we continue the service? For example, repair services.
Yeah, good question. So the question is, I think the question is, if we have shipped something to somebody before they got put onto a restricted list, can we continue to do things for them like repair that item afterwards? It really depends. I hate to say it depends. It's complicated. Um, when a company gets put on the list in the EAR world, then you cannot provide anything to them subject to the EAR, meaning um, any type of further physical items, software, or technology that is US origin, involves US persons, might have US content. If you can find a way to do that 100%, no connection with the US, no US persons, no US anything, um, then maybe you can continue to provide that kind of a service. Um, but what I would advise is that it's still pretty risky to do, and that you should take advice from an advisor before doing that, only because it's very risky.
All right, thank you, Anthony. I don't see any
All
more
right.
questions here. All I seeing are just compliments of and feedback about the presentation. Okay, thank you.
All
Any more
right.
words before we end?
That's it for me. Once again, thank you to everyone. Have a good day. Of course, if you have any questions afterwards, um, I believe my information. Ron, you have the you do have the PowerPoint. Ron, you
Yes.
should feel free to share that with whoever like wants to have it. And
Okay.
for anyone who has questions, my contact information is here. And please do feel free to reach out directly anytime, and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Anthony, for your insightful presentation. And thank you all to our participants for joining our session today. On behalf of the International Trade Council, we appreciate your time and engagement, and we hope that you found today's session valuable and informative. If you have any further questions or need additional resources, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you in our future events. Thank you, Anthony. Have a great day,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.